Dim the lights, dear listener. Maybe turn on a fan for a gentle hum, or let a fireplace crackle softly in the background. Wherever in the world you are, whether it's morning, twilight, or somewhere in the small hours, you are safe here. You're among history's quiet shadows now. No rush, no demands, just a long exhale and a whimsical stroll back through the winding alleys of time. Tonight, we return to the year, let's say 1253, somewhere in the English countryside, though it might just as easily be a Flemish village, a forested corner of Saxony, or a wind-blown plain in Burgundy. The stars are bright, the cows are quiet, and in a thatch-roofed cottage with wood smoke curling from the chimney, a girl places a carrot beneath her pillow. Yes, you heard that right. Carrot. Not because she's planning to make soup in her dreams, but because she's hoping, quite seriously, to see the face of the man she'll marry. In the curious courtship customs of medieval Europe, carrots weren't just for stews. They were symbols, charms, a vegetable talisman of love. And on the autumn feast of St. Michael, also called Michaelmas, maidens would place a freshly pulled carrot under their pillows and whisper the rhyme, St. Michael, so fair and so bright, let me dream of my true love tonight. Then they'd sleep, hoping to glimpse their future sweetheart in a dream. The results, predictably, were mixed. Some claimed vivid visions. Others reported nothing but root-scented pillows and aching necks. Still, the tradition persisted, because in the world of medieval dating, magic was very often the method. After all, how else was a girl from a farming family in a village of 30 people supposed to meet someone new? Let's stay a while in that candlelit cottage. The floor is packed earth, strewn with rushes. A few dried herbs hang from the rafters, sage, wormwood, rosemary. An old cat naps by the hearth, curled in the shape of a question mark. And in the glow of the firelight, our young dreamer, let's call her Ellen, is consulting a handful of dried St. John's wort petals she's tucked into a ribbon beside her bed. She's already tried the apple peel charm, slicing an apple carefully and throwing the long coil of peel over her shoulder to see if it would land in the shape of a letter, supposedly the first initial of her future husband. It landed vaguely, like an N, but Ellen wasn't entirely convinced. The cat pawed at it shortly after. Still, hope flickers eternal in the human heart. And in Ellen's world, where life is hard, choices are few, and dreams must often substitute for reality, these quaint rituals offered comfort, direction, and a kind of homemade divination. And Ellen was not alone. Across the medieval world, people practiced astonishingly strange, and strangely consistent, rituals to catch the eye of a sweetheart, or summon one from the ether. Some were sweet, some were silly, some were downright disturbing, but all of them reveal just how universal the longing for connection really was. Let us drift now, softly, gently, to the feast of St. Agnes, celebrated on the frosty night of January 20th. In some English towns, maidens would fast all day, eat a slice of salty cake before bed, then lie in silence with their hands tucked under their chins, hoping to dream of the man who would bring them water in the night. Superstition said that if they followed the ritual exactly, a vision would come, sometimes of a kind stranger, other times a shadowy figure who stood just out of reach. Not every girl liked the idea. Some found the fasting made them woozy, or the cakes far too salty to sleep, but others swore by it. There are even scattered records in church letters of young women fainting from devotion or from hunger, and being revived by a kindly priest who, one suspects, had been watching a bit too closely. The link between food, dreams, and love was everywhere, and perhaps nowhere was it stranger than in southern Germany, where some young women would take a slice of bread, smear it with honey and herbs, place it under their mattress, and then turn 3 times while reciting, "Bread beneath, honey to keep, let me see him in my sleep." Again, mixed results. Often the only thing they saw in the morning was a sticky patch and a trail of ants. But the belief held firm. Why? Because in a world without dating apps, mixers, or bookstores where you could pretend to read while making eyes across the aisle, people turned to charms, festivals, and the occasional goose-based ceremony. Yes, we'll get there. But first, imagine how small the social pool really was. You likely lived and died within 10 miles of your birthplace. Your choices were limited to the handful of young people nearby, and courtship was deeply entwined with property, family reputation, and church approval. You couldn't just wander into a tavern, smile at someone, and hope for the best. Not unless you wanted rumors or worse. And so love was often confined to the realm of the symbolic. This is why herbs, charms, and magical objects took on such power. It was a way to act, to try to exert some measure of agency in a rigid world. Holding time on your tongue while saying the name of a crush was believed to make your love grow in their heart. Burying a strand of your hair under a hawthorn tree at midnight was said to call a partner to you. And in Brittany, it was believed that tying two snails together with red thread and watching which one crawled toward you was a way of measuring romantic fate. Odd, yes. But then, all dating rituals seem strange when taken out of context. Even today, people swipe left and right on glowing rectangles, hoping for a spark. In the 13th century, they whispered rhymes to the moon and slept beside bundles of basil. Now, not all rituals were harmless. In parts of Ireland, a girl seeking to know her true love was advised to walk backward naked around a church at midnight on Halloween, 3 times, and peer through the keyhole to see the face of her future spouse. This was considered risky business, both spiritually and socially. But for those bold enough to try, the reward seemed worth it. Some even claimed to see not a man's face, but a skull, signifying that they would die unmarried. Understandably, that part of the ritual fell out of favor. Let's check back in on Ellen, our carrot-sleeping heroine. She hasn't had any dreams tonight. Not yet. But she does remember a tale told by the village wise woman, an old widow with 3 teeth and far too many opinions. According to her, the most powerful love charm of all involved mixing rosemary, a chicken's feather, and a pinch of ashes from a bridal hearth, wrapping them in parchment, and tucking them into your bodice for 7 days. The catch? It only worked if you didn't speak a single word during that week. Total silence. Few tried it. Even fewer succeeded. But there was always someone who claimed it had worked for a cousin's cousin, who now lived happily somewhere in Kent. In truth, love in the Middle Ages was often more practical than poetic. Families arranged matches, dowries were negotiated, and romantic ideals were often left out of the equation entirely. But even within those constraints, young people found ways to hope, to dream, to create space for wonder. There's something touching about that, something universal, because no matter the century, the language, or the bedding materials, people have always sought love. And in a world filled with danger, disease, and disappointment, the idea of seeing your beloved in a dream, even if only once, was a treasure worth chasing. So tonight, as you settle deeper into your covers, let the imagined scents of rosemary and carrot leaves drift around you. Hear the soft creak of wooden beams, the distant barking of a village dog, the rustle of straw as someone turns over in a simple bed and wonders if they'll see someone new behind their eyelids. Maybe they will. Maybe you will too. But for now, rest easy. Love, strange, sweet, stubborn love, has always found a way. Not all signs of love in the Middle Ages were subtle. Some were noisy, boisterous, embarrassingly public. In parts of France and Italy, there existed a peculiar custom known as the chivalric. If a couple was mismatched, say a much older man marrying a young girl, or a widow remarrying quickly, the local villagers would gather outside their home on the wedding night and make a ruckus. Pans were banged, horns blown, songs shouted at the window. The goal? To shame the pair or, sometimes, to pressure a small payment in exchange for silence. But as with many medieval customs, the chivalry could turn romantic, even mischievous. In one tale from Poitiers, a boy led a false chivalry outside the home of his beloved, not because she had married, but because she hadn't. The noise was his message. I'm still here. I'm still waiting. Her father didn't appreciate the gesture. But the girl, it said, smiled from behind the shutter. A week later, the boy disappeared from town, off to a distant cousin's farm, many believed. And a month after that, so did she. Were they reunited? Did they meet in secret and build a life away from the banging pans and peering eyes? We don't know. But the story lingered, passed down from neighbor to neighbor like a love letter folded into a loaf of bread. Public performance, even rowdy disruption, was part of how love was spoken when it couldn't be said. Let us leave the noisy streets behind and slip now into the quiet stillness of a nunnery library, where parchment pages whisper as they turn. Here, love looked very different. Though monks and nuns were sworn to chastity, the heart does not always heed vows. And the writings of cloistered life reveal not only divine longing, but deeply human yearning as well. In a convent near Cologne in the 12th century, a nun named Hildegard wrote passionate letters to a fellow sister, letters filled with admiration, adoration, and a language that blurred the lines between sacred and personal. She wrote of radiant faces, aching dreams, and the desire to be near, always near. Were her words spiritual or romantic? We cannot say for certain, but it reminds us that even in silence and seclusion, the longing for connection lived on. Other convents preserved love relics, locks of hair, tokens, and even anonymous poems, tucked into the bindings of devotional books. They weren't meant to be found, but they were, and centuries later, we still read them with a curious hush, as if overhearing someone else's secret. It wasn't always poetic. In some monasteries, more practical arrangements were made. Illicit letters sent by candlelight, rendezvous arranged during pilgrimage. The punishment, if discovered, was severe, but many risked it, because love, once felt, is hard to lock away behind stone walls. And so, from the farm girl with her carrot to the nun with her quill, we see again how strange and stubborn the heart can be. Now, dear listener, let us turn to one of the more curious superstitions of medieval love, the idea that certain objects could physically trap affection. In 14th century Moravia, it was said that if you carved your name and the name of your intended into a wooden spoon, stirred it 3 times into your lover's cup when they weren't looking, and then kissed the spoon beneath the first moon of spring, their love would never leave you. This belief was widespread enough that some suspicious housewives in Prague began inspecting all their spoons. Elsewhere, girls would sew their names into the hems of garments gifted to their beloveds, hidden beneath embroidery or inside seams. If the garment was worn and the thread held, the love would stay. If the thread unraveled, it meant a heart already drifting away. In one preserved shirt from Yorkshire, a faint line of silk thread runs just beneath the collar. Inside the stitching, Ellen, ever thine. A different Ellen, perhaps. Or maybe the same one years later grown bolder, or wiser, or both. Love left traces everywhere, on scratched pews in forgotten chapels, on tree trunks bent with age, still bearing initials that once mattered deeply, on the back of a carved chess piece found buried near the Baltic coast, with the word wait etched beneath in runic script. And perhaps the most charming ritual of all was found in the hills of Wales. There, during the cold months, boys would begin carving what were called love spoons, elaborate wooden tokens filled with symbols, a horseshoe for luck, a key for home, a heart for affection. Some even included cages carved from a single block of wood, with small balls rolling freely inside, symbolizing the complexity and care of true love. It might take weeks or months to complete, and when it was finished, the boy would present it to the girl of his choosing. If she accepted it, the courtship would begin. If not, the spoon was returned, or, in some tales, burned in the hearth as a quiet ending. But not all love spoons were romantic. Some were carved by fathers for daughters, by sons for mothers, as expressions of affection in a world with few other ways to say, I care. So much of medieval love, you see, was about symbols, tokens, gestures. Words were precious, actions even more so, and for every love spoon carved, there were a dozen moments of silent hoping. A glance across a market stall, a pause before passing in a corridor, a finger brushing a sleeve. It is easy to think of the Middle Ages as harsh, loveless, repressive. But even within its rigid structures, affection bloomed like flowers between stones, hidden, small, but real. And not all rituals were about finding a match. Some were about protection, preserving love once it had arrived. In Catalonia, newlywed couples would place sprigs of lavender and mugwort beneath their mattress to ward off envy. In Poland, a bride's veil might be stitched with a thread, soaked in holy water to seal the bond against gossip. In the Low Countries, lovers were warned never to cross a bridge together before marriage. It was said to invite discord. Of course, these ideas seem quaint now, but consider how seriously they were taken. In one 15th century diary, a young husband wrote of his guilt after forgetting to hang rosemary above the doorpost on his wedding night. The next morning, his wife stubbed her toe and dropped the breakfast pot. "The omen is fulfilled," he wrote. "I shall be a poor husband yet." Whether he was or not, we don't know, but the belief speaks volumes. Even the skeptical had their moments. One merchant in Bruges, having scoffed for years at love charms and foolish peasants, was discovered to have hidden a painted tile beneath his pillow, depicting two figures embracing beside a blooming tree. No explanation given. None needed. Love makes believers of us all. And in the last days of winter, when the snow still clung to the thatch and the winds howled like spirits across the moors, even the most sensible among them might pause before tossing out the last of the Yule greenery, wondering if, perhaps, a bit of mistletoe should be left up a while longer just in case. So let us leave our chapter here, wrapped in rosemary and old lace, surrounded by whispered names and carefully carved spoons. The rituals may seem strange, even silly, but behind them lies the most timeless of hopes, that someone somewhere is dreaming of you too. Rest now, dear listener. The fire grows low, the cat sighs in its sleep, and a single carrot lies beneath a pillow, untouched, but not unloved. Sleep comes softly, and who knows, perhaps you'll dream of someone. Not all signs of love in the Middle Ages were subtle. Some were noisy, boisterous, embarrassingly public. In parts of France and Italy, there existed a peculiar custom known as the chivalric. If a couple was mismatched, say a much older man marrying a young girl, or a widow remarrying quickly, the local villagers would gather outside their home on the wedding night and make a ruckus. Hands were banged, horns blown, songs shouted at the window. The goal? To shame the pair or, sometimes, to pressure a small payment in exchange for silence. But as with many medieval customs, the chivalry could turn romantic, even mischievous. In one tale from Poitiers, a boy led a false chivalry outside the home of his beloved, not because she had married, but because she hadn't. The noise was his message. "I'm still here. I'm still waiting." Her father didn't appreciate the gesture, but the girl, it said, smiled from behind the shutter. A week later, the boy disappeared from town, off to a distant cousin's farm, many believed. And a month after that, so did she. Were they reunited? Did they meet in secret and build a life away from the banging pans and peering eyes? We don't know, but the story lingered, passed down from neighbor to neighbor like a love letter folded into a loaf of bread. Public performance, even rowdy disruption, was part of how love was spoken when it couldn't be said. Let us leave the noisy streets behind and slip now into the quiet stillness of a nunnery library, where parchment pages whisper as they turn. Here, love looked very different. Though monks and nuns were sworn to chastity, the heart does not always heed vows. And the writings of cloistered life reveal not only divine longing, but deeply human yearning as well. In a convent near Cologne in the 12th century, a nun named Hildegard wrote passionate letters to a fellow sister, letters filled with admiration, adoration, and a language that blurred the lines between sacred and personal. She wrote of radiant faces, aching dreams, and the desire to be near, always near. Were her words spiritual or romantic? We cannot say for certain, but it reminds us that even in silence and seclusion, the longing for connection lived on. Other convents preserved love relics, locks of hair, tokens, and even anonymous poems, tucked into the bindings of devotional books. They weren't meant to be found, but they were, and centuries later, we still read them with a curious hush, as if overhearing someone else's secret. It wasn't always poetic. In some monasteries, more practical arrangements were made. Illicit letters sent by candlelight, rendezvous arranged during pilgrimage. The punishment, if discovered, was severe, but many risked it, because love, once felt, is hard to lock away behind stone walls. And so, from the farm girl with her carrot to the nun with her quill, we see again how strange and stubborn the heart can be. Now, dear listener, let us turn to one of the more curious superstitions of medieval love, the idea that certain objects could physically trap affection. In 14th century Moravia, it was said that if you carved your name and the name of your intended into a wooden spoon, stirred it 3 times into your lover's cup when they weren't looking, and then kissed the spoon beneath the first moon of spring, their love would never leave you. This belief was widespread enough that some suspicious housewives in Prague began inspecting all their spoons. Elsewhere, girls would sew their names into the hems of garments gifted to their beloveds, hidden beneath embroidery or inside seams. If the garment was worn and the thread held, the love would stay. If the thread unraveled, it meant a heart already drifting away. In one preserved shirt from Yorkshire, a faint line of silk thread runs just beneath the collar. Inside the stitching, Ellen, ever thine. A different Ellen, perhaps. Or maybe the same one years later grown bolder. Or wiser. Or both. Love left traces everywhere. On scratched pews in forgotten chapels. On tree trunks bent with age, still bearing initials that once mattered deeply. On the back of a carved chess piece found buried near the Baltic coast, with the word wait etched beneath in runic script. And perhaps the most charming ritual of all was found in the hills of Wales. There, during the cold months, boys would begin carving what were called love spoons, elaborate wooden tokens filled with symbols. A horseshoe for luck, a key for home, a heart for affection. Some even included cages carved from a single block of wood, with small balls rolling freely inside, symbolizing the complexity and care of true love. It might take weeks or months to complete, and when it was finished, the boy would present it to the girl of his choosing. If she accepted it, the courtship would begin. If not, the spoon was returned, or, in some tales, burned in the hearth as a quiet ending. But not all love spoons were romantic. Some were carved by fathers for daughters, by sons for mothers, as expressions of affection in a world with few other ways to say, I care. So much of medieval love, you see, was about symbols, tokens, gestures. Words were precious, actions even more so, and for every love spoon carved, there were a dozen moments of silent hoping. A glance across a market stall, a pause before passing in a corridor, a finger brushing a sleeve. It is easy to think of the Middle Ages as harsh, loveless, repressive. But even within its rigid structures, affection bloomed like flowers between stones. Hidden, small, but real. And not all rituals were about finding a match. Some were about protection, preserving love once it had arrived. In Catalonia, newlywed couples would place sprigs of lavender and mugwort beneath their mattress to ward off envy. In Poland, a bride's veil might be stitched with a thread, soaked in holy water to seal the bond against gossip. In the Low Countries, lovers were warned never to cross a bridge together before marriage. It was said to invite discord. Of course, these ideas seem quaint now, but consider how seriously they were taken. In one 15th century diary, a young husband wrote of his guilt after forgetting to hang rosemary above the doorpost on his wedding night. The next morning, his wife stubbed her toe and dropped the breakfast pot. The omen is fulfilled, he wrote. I shall be a poor husband yet. Whether he was or not, we don't know. But the belief speaks volumes. Even the skeptical had their moments. One merchant in Bruges, having scoffed for years at love charms and foolish peasants, was discovered to have hidden a painted tile beneath his pillow, depicting 2 figures embracing beside a blooming tree. No explanation given. None needed. Love makes believers of us all. And in the last days of winter, when the snow still clung to the thatch and the winds howled like spirits across the moors, even the most sensible among them might pause before tossing out the last of the Yule greenery, wondering if, perhaps, a bit of mistletoe should be left up a while longer just in case. So let us leave our chapter here, wrapped in rosemary and old lace, surrounded by whispered names and carefully carved spoons. The rituals may seem strange, even silly, but behind them lies the most timeless of hopes, that someone somewhere is dreaming of you too. Rest now, dear listener. The fire grows low, the cat sighs in its sleep, and a single carrot lies beneath a pillow, untouched, but not unloved. Sleep comes softly, and who knows, Perhaps you'll dream of someone. In the waning light of a spring day, across the English countryside and into the valleys of France, one might find another curious token of affection, the folded letter of secret verse. Not a formal message signed and waxed, but a slip of parchment tucked into a basket of eggs, or between the folds of a linen delivery. A love note, clumsy or clever, delivered not by hand, but by circumstance. Such letters were often anonymous, not because of shame, but because of danger. Courtship could be scandalous business. A maid writing to a steward, a shepherd writing to the reeve's daughter. These were not matches that would bring celebration, and so coded language bloomed. I saw your shadow on the lane might mean, I watched you walk past and wished you'd stayed. Your dog barked at me today could mean, I think you noticed me. And if someone wrote, the sky was gray, but the hay smelled sweet, that was more or less a declaration of love. In a world where most couldn't read, these letters were passed and read aloud by those who could. Friends, cousins, the occasional sympathetic clerk. Some were dictated at the alehouse to someone with neat handwriting and a loose tongue. Most were never answered, but a few were folded back. There's an account from the region of Lotharingia, dated 1328, of two parchment makers who courted each other entirely in verse. Their exchanges were copied and saved by a local monk amused by the idea. One stanza read, If parchment is my trade, then ink is what I crave. Your eyes are like dark letters, and your smile the script I brave. Cheesy? Absolutely, but no less sincere for it. Let's not forget, medieval people weren't emotionless figures in oil paintings. They swooned, they flirted, they pined. They giggled in corners and dreamed of stolen moments. Love was as much a part of their world as harvests and hunger. And like everything else in their lives, it was shaped by time, place, and class. The wealthy had poems and troubadours. The middling had market stalls and maypoles. The poor had eye contact, shared bread, and hope. And hope, in those centuries, was sometimes all they had. For many young people, love came not in verse or vegetables, but in labor. A blacksmith's apprentice might meet a brewer's daughter when delivering horseshoes. A shepherd might share shade with a spinner on the hill and exchange no more than 3 words, but think of her every day after. Relationships kindled over weeks, months, of watching, waiting, sharing small kindnesses. And in some regions, work itself became the vehicle of proposal. In Sweden, for instance, there existed the test of bread. A suitor would deliver a freshly baked loaf to the door of his beloved. She would examine it, its crust, its color, its weight. If she found it well made, she would send back a small piece with her handkerchief tied around it. If she did not approve, she would send the crust chewed. The message was clear. Elsewhere, courtship rituals took the form of shared chores. In villages across Austria, young men were permitted to help a girl tend her family's fields during harvest. If they worked well together, it was seen as a sign. If not, the neighbors would take note. There was a saying in those parts, a man who cannot stack hay with her cannot stay with her. More than one marriage was decided by how someone swung a sickle. And while such practical tests might seem cold to modern ears, they reflected a hard truth. Medieval marriage wasn't just about passion. It was survival. A partner was someone who would share your burdens, carry water, tend fire, bury children, hold your hand through sickness, famine, and plague. Choosing well was essential. Choosing poorly could doom a household, which makes the whimsical rituals of youth, the dreams, the dances, the dolls wrapped in silk, all the more touching, because behind them was an ache for something gentler. Speaking of dolls, in the mountains of northern Italy, girls would craft tiny figures out of straw and cloth during the weeks leading up to Lent. They were called inamorate little loves, and they were treated with immense care. The girl would dress her doll, name it, even speak to it about her romantic hopes. On the final day before Lent, the doll was either hidden, if the girl still had no sweetheart, or burned if she did. In this way, the doll became both a confidant and a rite of passage. Some said that if the doll burned with a clean flame, the girl would be married within the year. If it smoked and sputtered, well, another year of waiting. We can smile at the superstition, but the heart of it remains familiar. the longing to be seen, chosen, cherished. A doll of straw becomes a stand-in for the wishes we dare not say aloud. Let us step now into the warmth of a spring fair in a Flemish town square. The bells have rung. The booths are open. The smell of fried dough and sweet wine fills the air. And among the tents and trinkets, young men and women gather around the whispering well. A festival game, half joke, half charm. The rule is simple. Speak the name of the one you love into the well, then drop in a coin. If it lands with a ring, your love is returned. If it lands with a thud, try again next year. Children laugh. Teenagers blush. Old women peer suspiciously to see who says which name. Sometimes, two voices echo the same name at once. Sometimes one is answered by silence. But no one mocks, because the well listens to all. From superstition to sincerity, these customs threaded the lives of medieval people with a kind of romantic rhythm. Whether through dolls or dances, ribbons or riddles, they created space, however small, for hope. And in the depths of winter, when nothing green grew, and the sky pressed low, such hope mattered. It was not only the poor who longed for love's certainty. Among the elite, arrangements were made not only for politics, but for legacy. And yet, even within these contracts, affection could bloom. There's a letter preserved in the Aragonese Royal Archive, a note from a young bride, married at 14 to a noble twice her age. She writes not of complaint, but of kindness. He does not mock my Latin, and he lets me finish my lute songs before he speaks. That is enough, I think. A low bar, perhaps, but in her world, a meaningful gesture. Love, as it turns out, is not always fireworks. Sometimes it's simply being allowed to finish your song. Elsewhere, in Paris, a scribe known for his sharp wit compiled a list of signs of true affection, which included such gems as, "She waits for your turn at the well and fills your bucket while she draws hers. He offers you the unburnt end of the bread. She speaks your name only once, but remembers it always." These were not grand acts, but they were acts nonetheless. And in a world where fate was fickle and futures uncertain, such small things took on great weight. We often look back and think the Middle Ages were cold and rigid, that love was a luxury only the rich could afford. But the truth is, love found a way, in whispered names, in carved spoons, in floating wreaths and salted cakes. Even in silence, love spoke volumes. So as this first chapter draws to a close, and the candlelight fades low across our imagined cottage, let's remember Ellen, Tib, Gereva, and all the nameless lovers who wrapped their hopes in charms and dreams. Love was strange then. It is strange now. But always, always, it is human. May your dreams tonight be soft. And may someone, somewhere, be carving your name into a spoon. The first warm breeze of spring in a medieval town often brought more than just the scent of damp earth and blooming elderflower. It brought anticipation, whispers, a new pair of boots laid out carefully, a ribbon tied in freshly brushed hair. Because soon, perhaps this very Sunday, the fair would come. And with it, the possibility of romance. For many people in the Middle Ages, fairs were more than just a break from the backbreaking routine of daily life. They were arenas of opportunity, not just to buy goods or hear music or stuff one's mouth with goose pies and candied figs, but to flirt, to dance, to linger by a stall longer than necessary because the person behind it had kind eyes. Fairs were among the rare public spaces where young people could interact under the somewhat loosened gaze of social expectation. While elders might still be watching, the crowd, the chaos, and the noise gave cover for shy glances and accidental touches. And oh, how many stories began between the linen and the lutes. Let's travel to one such fair, in the market square of Lincoln, around the year 1286. Stalls stretch from the church to the blacksmith's yard. A juggler balances a goose on his head. Children dart beneath tables. Somewhere, a minstrelsy trio is tuning their lutes with all the seriousness of cathedral musicians. At one stall, brightly dyed cloth is being sold red, saffron, and a deep, almost plum blue. A boy in patched boots stands holding a scrap of green wool, pretending to inspect the weave. In truth, he is not looking at the fabric. He is watching the girl who tends the counter, who is, in turn, pretending not to notice him. Their entire conversation consists of 6 words. Strong thread. The strongest. He leaves the coin and the scrap and walks away smiling. That is all. And that is everything. Because fairs were filled with such moments. The glance over a spice bin. The mutual reach for a pie. The accidental brushing of hands while passing a jug. In some regions, these interactions were built into the structure of the fair itself. Take the love market of Terni in Umbria, held annually on the feast of St. Valentine. Young men and women were allowed, encouraged even, to mingle freely, walking arm in arm around the piazza under the watchful eye of the town elders. If a couple walked together 3 times around the fountain of St. Restituta, it was considered an unofficial engagement. If they walked once, well, it was a hint. 2 was confusion. 3, love. In England, the tradition of flirting booths was common at May fairs. These weren't formal structures, but informal games hosted by young women, where men could pay a penny to have a small token thrown at them. An apple, a ribbon, sometimes a dried herb. If the girl threw with a smile, it was a sign of welcome. If she threw it hard, the message was also clear. In truth, these were less transactions than theater, an excuse to break the rigid rules of everyday life for a few hours of play. And in those brief breaks from formality, love sometimes slipped through. Many communities held courtship dances on fairgrounds, circle dances, partner reels, and competitive games like kissing tag. These events were noisy, muddy, and utterly unromantic to watch. But for those inside the games, the rush of adrenaline and joy could spark something unexpected. Imagine a girl running across the grass, dress hitched to her knees, laughter flying from her mouth. A boy gaining on her, heart pounding, not just from the run. They stumble. She's caught. A kiss is stolen on the cheek, or maybe the sleeve. Faces flushed, chests heaving. Then the music calls again, and they're off in different directions. Later, perhaps, he finds her again, offers her a sugared almond, asks nothing, just offers. She accepts. A beginning. In German-speaking regions, spring festivals sometimes featured riddle stalls, where suitors would pose clever rhymes to the girls behind the counter. If the girl couldn't answer, she owed the boy a dance. If she did, he owed her a sweet. Some of the riddles survive in odd little manuscripts. What walks on 4 legs at dawn, 2 at noon, and 3 at dusk? The answer, of course, is man crawling, walking, and leaning in old age. But in one fair record from 1391, a boy asks, "What flower blooms when none do, but is plucked only when all are picked?" The girl's answer? The smile of the last girl left standing. He danced with her anyway. Love, fairgoers believed, should be clever and public, but not too public. For every open flirtation, there were 10 hidden ones. Behind stalls, beneath cloaks, in the moments between the mead and the next song. In some towns, married women would chaperone pairs of young people during fairs, offering what they called the veil, a small space of sanctioned privacy. The girl would be seated, the boy allowed to speak to her softly for a set number of minutes, while the chaperone stood nearby humming or polishing her buckle. It was understood. Nothing inappropriate, nothing lasting, but a moment, a chance. And sometimes that was all it took. Of course, not everyone welcomed fair flirtations. Churchmen railed against the liberties taken during festival time. Sermons were given warning against loose laces and looser morals. In 1320, one angry bishop in Canterbury tried to outlaw maypole dances altogether, citing a great proliferation of bastard children born to the music of flutes. His decree was ignored. The music continued. And why wouldn't it? For many, these fairs were the only time they could hope to meet someone outside their immediate village. Travel was rare, letters rarer. A 3-day festival might be your only chance all year to find a partner, romantic or otherwise. In this way, the fair became not just a celebration, but a marketplace of possibilities. Sometimes those possibilities ended in marriage. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they ended in scandal, yes. But just as often, they ended in memory, sweet, sharp, and safe. One old woman, interviewed in the late 19th century, remembered as a child hearing her grandmother say, "I met your grandfather at the St. Cyprian's fair. He gave me a handful of cherries, and I gave him my glove." They married 4 years later. But the glove came first. There were tokens, always. The glove, the ribbon, the half-eaten tart handed shyly. In Hungary, a piece of carved fruit was a common flirtation gift. In parts of France, it was an embroidered kerchief. In the Netherlands, a coin that had been held in the mouth, symbolizing a wish spoken without words. To outsiders, these gestures seemed cryptic. But to the people exchanging them, they were everything. One boy might spend hours choosing the right apple, polishing it, holding it in his palm until it was warm, then placing it in the girl's hand, eyes never meeting hers. One girl might sew her initials into the corner of a cloth just subtle enough to be missed by everyone, except the boy she hoped would find it. And when he did, if he did, he might tuck it inside his jerkin, close to his chest, and say nothing. For a day, for a year, maybe forever. But he'd remember. We all remember those first tokens. The first fair. The first music that felt like it was playing just for us. Even in a world of dirt roads and rough bread, of debts and frost and hard laws, love found its corners. The fair was one of them. And so, as we walk away now from the crowd and clamor, as the candles gutter low and the music fades into memory, let us carry with us the scent of spring wine, the laughter on the wind, and the echo of wooden shoes on cobbled stone. The fair will return next year, and perhaps so will they. As dusk fell on the final day of the fair, there was a custom in many towns that brought all the flirtation and festivity to a soft, flickering close: the candle walk. In this tradition, girls carried small beeswax candles in clay holders, each flame protected by a loop of cloth or a wooden hood. Boys would walk behind them in silence, slowly, carefully. At first glance, it seemed like a procession, a religious thing, perhaps. But it was not for saints. It was for signaling. If a girl allowed a boy to walk beside her, or passed her candle to him to hold, it meant he might call on her again. If she stepped ahead and kept the flame to herself, the message was gentle but final. Not this time. It was quiet, dignified, and heartbreakingly clear. Older villagers would stand along the edges of the square, arms folded, eyes soft with memory. They too had once walked behind flickering lights, hearts thudding like festival drums. It was a kind way to say yes, and a kinder way to say no. In truth, most of these courtship customs, strange as they seem, were about making the hard parts of love softer, safer, more survivable. Because when a boy gave a girl an apple, or a girl offered a dance, or a lad waited all day to carry a bucket of water for a shepherdess he admired, it was never just about fruit, or music, or chores. It was about courage, about putting a hope into motion, and offering it up without knowing what would come. That was true for everyone, from peasant to prince. Let us turn now, for a moment, to the noble courts of France and Burgundy, where flirtation was wrapped not in apples or dancing, but in poetry, performance, and games of wit. In the court of Duke Philip the Good of Burgundy, Valentine's Day was more than a saint's feast. It was a spectacle. The court held what they called La Cour d'Amours, the court of love. Here, noble women played judges and noblemen became petitioners, presenting cases of fictional heartbreak, betrayal, or longing. Each plea was poetic, rhymed, clever. It was less a trial than a performance. A knight might stand and declare, "My lady frowns, though I have fought 3 duels for her favor, and now she wears another's sleeve. Shall I stay faithful or grieve?" A lady, seated in satin, might reply, "If your duels are done, and her love has run, then grieve for a time but stay. The faithful man who smiles again finds truer love," they say. Laughter, applause, and occasional blushes followed. It was play, yes, but meaningful play. Many of the relationships that began in such courts of love grew into something more serious: marriage, or lifelong affection, or dangerous scandal. But at their core, they offered what all these customs offered: a way to speak without saying everything, to risk affection without risking the full brunt of rejection. Because in the Middle Ages, just as today hearts were fragile things. And while noble courts reveled in metaphor, the countryside had its own ways of wrapping meaning in ritual. In parts of Wales, boys carved verses onto birch bark and tied them to a girl's front gate. These were called love letters, though few contained more than 4 or 5 lines. If the girl kept the bark, it was a welcome. If it disappeared and was replaced with sheep dung, well, it had been refused. In Scotland, lads and lasses played the oaten cake game. Each would take a bite of a shared oat cake while staring into each other's eyes. If one broke the gaze first, they owed the other a favor. A kiss, a ribbon, a chore performed in silence. Many boys pretended to lose. There were, too, the games of prediction. At Candlemas, girls might melt lead or wax into cold water, letting the shapes reveal hints of their future lover. A sword for a soldier, a hammer for a blacksmith, a crown for a nobleman. The shapes were vague, open to interpretation, and that was the point. The heart reads what it wants to see. And then, there was the kiss in the ring. This was perhaps the most famous of all festival flirtations. A group would form a circle, boys on one side, girls on the other. A ring would be passed from hand to hand in secret while music played. When the music stopped, the person holding the ring had to walk across and offer it with a kiss to someone of their choosing. Sometimes it was playful, sometimes bold, sometimes it broke hearts, because if the ring was offered and declined, well, everyone would see. Still, people played, again and again, because that was the way of it. The longing was stronger than the fear. We like to imagine ourselves more advanced now, more direct, but deep down we still leave signs, still drop hints, still hope someone is watching when we laugh a little too loudly or linger at the doorway. Medieval people were no different, just a bit more poetic about it. There's a love note from 1372, scratched into the margin of a book of Psalms. I saw thee at the well, and I did not speak, but I have thought of your hand and the shape of your cheek. If God is kind, may we share bread once more. Until then, I am yours, behind the door. We do not know who wrote it, or for whom, but someone held that book, turned that page, and left those words behind like a pressed flower. Not every fair ended in marriage. Not every dance led to devotion, but all of them meant something. And long after the last booth was taken down, long after the ribbons were untied and the fire pits cold, the memories lingered. The scent of someone's hair, the sound of a voice singing off-key but joyfully, the brief touch of a hand in the dark. These are the things that outlast banners and bells, the things that make us human. And as the last candle of the fair flickers out, and the village sleeps beneath a sky full of stars, one can imagine, somewhere, a girl lying in bed, holding a scrap of cloth that smells faintly of smoke and cloves. A boy, turning a ribbon over and over in his hand, unsure what it means. Or a widow, smiling to herself in the dark, remembering a boy with nervous eyes and a misshapen pie who once asked her to dance under the maypole. The years go on, the fairs return, and still, love lingers. In the candlelit halls of medieval courts, beneath banners embroidered with lions and lilies, love wore a very different mask. Here, romance was rarely about stolen glances behind the market stall or kisses beneath the maypole. Instead, it was cloaked in negotiation, weighed in silver and written into treaties. Among the nobility, love did not bloom freely. It was summoned, and yet, even in the most formal of unions, where land was traded like cattle and a girl's dowry defined her worth, affection still crept in through the cracks. Let us step into the court of Eleanor of Aquitaine. It is the year 1152. Eleanor, one of the most powerful and fiercely intelligent women of her age, has recently divorced the King of France. Scandalous, yes, but not nearly as scandalous as what followed. Only 8 weeks later, she married Henry Plantagenet, 11 years her junior and the soon-to-be King of England. Historians still debate whether it was a political move, a romantic impulse, or both. But contemporary gossip suggested a whirlwind courtship, whispered conversations in stone halls, and a shared love of poetry and falconry. They would go on to rule a vast empire, and to fight bitterly, betray each other, and eventually live apart. But for a time there was fire, real affection. It wasn't common, but it wasn't unheard of either. Because sometimes, two people caught in the machinery of royal obligation looked at each other and saw a possibility. More often, though, noble courtship began with distance. A father would write to another, offering his daughter for alliance. The young couple might not even meet until the week of their wedding. Sometimes not until the ceremony itself. There's a famous account from Castile in 1328, in which a noblewoman wept openly at her wedding, not because she was unhappy, but because she had expected someone older, and was surprised by the boyish face of her new husband. They would go on to exchange hundreds of letters over the years. Many survive. One, written in Latin, simply reads, "I did not think I could laugh again, but then you spilled wine on the bishop and winked at me. That is all. I thought you should know." It's not a grand declaration, but in the rigid halls of court it might as well have been a sonnet. Let's pause here to explore the tools of noble romance. Because while the poor carved spoons or exchanged apples, the aristocracy had a language all its own. A favor, a glance, a poem passed behind a tapestry. Tokens were essential. A knight might wear a lady's glove tucked into his armor before a tournament. A silk ribbon might be hidden in a saddle or tied to a lance. These gifts were both inspiration and signal, proof that a lady watched, and a knight rode for more than glory. Of course, not all of these relationships were innocent. Courtly love, an idea born in the courts of Provence and spread through troubadour song, encouraged noblemen to adore married ladies from afar. This was not love in the modern sense. It was admiration, longing, the cultivation of exquisite heartbreak. A knight might sing for a woman he could never touch, might compose verses comparing her to the Virgin Mary or a hawk in flight. He might stand beneath her window for hours and never speak a word. To love was to suffer, they believed, and the more noble the suffering, the truer the love. Today, we might call that melodramatic. But in a world where most marriages were arranged and most emotions had no outlet, courtly love became a kind of social safety valve. It allowed people to feel, to long, to ache, without threatening the fragile network of alliances and inheritances that kept kingdoms from collapsing. And sometimes, just sometimes, the longing turned real. There's a story from the court of Navarre in which a lady's knight confessor, assigned to guard her virtue, fell in love with her instead. He refused to take communion unless she gave him a token. She refused. He fell into a melancholy. She relented, giving him a red thread from her sleeve. He wore it until his death 50 years later. Was it romance? Obsession? Devotion? History leaves us to guess. Not all noble women were passive participants in this system. Some, like Eleanor of Aquitaine, maneuvered it to their advantage. Others bent it until it snapped. Consider the case of Joan of Kent. Joan was married in secret at the age of 12 to a knight she loved. Her family, horrified, had the marriage annulled and married her off to someone else. But Joan never gave up. Years later, with the help of legal scholars and sympathetic priests, she managed to have her first marriage reinstated and the second dissolved. Eventually, she would marry the Prince of Wales and become mother to the future King Richard II. But she never stopped wearing the token of her first love. Even at court, even in jewels and brocade, the heart had its voice. Let us now visit a quieter story, one not found in royal ledgers or grand romances, but tucked away in a personal account by a chambermaid in the service of a minor duchess in Saxony. The maid recounts that her mistress once fell in love with a falconer. Not a nobleman, not a soldier, a man who trained birds. The duchess, bound by duty, could not speak of it. But every week, she requested that the falconer deliver the birds to her personally, so she might observe their progress. He brought her a kestrel, and she named it after her dead sister. He brought her a goshawk, and she wept when it returned injured. At last, he brought her a peregrine, fierce, sharp, untamable. She did not cry when it flew away. 3 years later, she married a count. The falconer left court, but the maid wrote, she kept a single feather in her psalter, and once, when she thought herself alone, I heard her say the bird's name. There's no epilogue, no grand scandal, just a feather, a name, and a woman who dared to love, however briefly. Not every story ends in marriage. Not every romance ends in ruin. Some begin and end with nothing more than a sigh. But some noble romances did lead to lasting unions. Isabella of France and Edward II had one of the most famously troubled royal marriages in history, but her parents, Philip IV and Joan I of Navarre, were by all accounts genuinely affectionate. Philip would call her Ma Douce in public, my sweet. In a court full of grim politics and constant maneuvering, it was rare to see a king smile at his wife. People noticed. Chroniclers wrote it down. Because even among the powerful, love stood out. It always does. There are accounts of kings who kissed their wives before battle, of queens who sent herbs and honey to their injured husbands, of noble women who learned to read not for scripture, but to write their own letters in their own hand to the men they waited for across distant borders. One such letter, preserved in a Florentine archive, reads, "My lord, I saw your banner in a dream. It was tattered, but still flying. I do not know if this means you live, but I woke smiling. Please, if you do live, write me your silence." That was all. We do not know if he answered, but we know she wrote, and that is something. In all the finery of noble courts, in the gold-threaded gowns, the jewel-crusted goblets, the Latin prayers and bone-handled knives, love still found its place, between the creases of a letter, in a feather tucked into a book, in the refusal to forget. And as we leave these noble halls, heavy with perfume and politics, let us carry with us not just the stories of treaties and scandals, but the quieter ones. The smile across a banquet table, the poem left on a saddle, the soft, unspoken vow that outlasted the war. Because even in castles made of stone, hearts were always tender. At the heart of every royal court was a mirror, not the silver kind, framed in carved wood, but a social one, held up by rumor, legend, and the ever-watchful eyes of courtiers. Every gesture between noble lovers was scrutinized, speculated upon, and passed along in whispers. And still, amid all that, love tried to live. We return to Eleanor of Aquitaine once more, not just because of her boldness, but because of her poetry. She, like many aristocrats of her day, was fluent in the language of the troubadours. Their verses, full of longing and coded allegory, were more than entertainment. They were flirtation, veiled commentary, sometimes even protest. A stanza might appear simple. My lady stands beneath the moon, her silence louder than the drum. If only I could change my tune, perhaps at last her hand would come. But to those in the know, those watching her court, it could be a subtle challenge, or a confession, or both. For nobility, language was armor and arrow. The wrong word could doom a marriage or embolden an affair. This is why gifts were so essential. A necklace with 5 pearls might hint at 5 nights spent together. A ring, given before battle, might say, "Return and remember." These gifts, though opulent, served the same purpose as a poor man's apple or a fairground ribbon. They were symbols, anchors, and sometimes apologies. One noblewoman, whose name is lost to time but whose belongings were recorded in a monastery ledger after her death, had a chest of embroidered handkerchiefs, 23 in total, each with initials, none matching her husband's. One of them, frayed and faded, bore a simple monogram, a +M. Next to it, in a smaller hand, someone had written in charcoal, "My once, not my always, not my forever, just once." In a world where permanence was rare, where childbirth was deadly and war constant, sometimes once had to be enough. Let us not forget that the medieval noblewoman, for all her silks and songs, lived with extraordinary constraints. She could not easily choose her husband, her household, or her fate. But in secret, small ways, she sometimes chose her heart. There is a tale, part history, part legend, of a lady of Poitiers who embroidered her thoughts into the hem of her gown. In tiny, perfect stitches, she wrote verses only she could read as the fabric moved. Her husband, a duke with little poetry in his soul, never noticed. But one day, A visiting knight bent to kiss her hand and paused. He had read the final line. Where words are not allowed, let thread remember. They say he said nothing aloud. But when he left court, he took with him a ribbon of that same blue silk, and never returned. Some stories end not with kisses, but with understanding. Even queens were not exempt from longing. Margaret of Anjou, wife of Henry VI of England, was a formidable figure in politics, but her personal life was harder to control. Her husband suffered bouts of debilitating mental illness, and Margaret often stood alone in governing the realm. During this time, rumors swirled of a deep and possibly romantic friendship between her and one of her husband's chief commanders. Was it love? Was it partnership? The chronicles are careful, vague, respectful. But Margaret commissioned a tapestry depicting a falcon and a lion, two animals rarely paired. The falcon was her symbol, the lion his. She hung it behind her reading chair, still debated, because in the absence of outright declaration, people look for symbols, as they always have. Let's step away now from royalty and look briefly at the merchant class, those rising in cities like Bruges, Florence, and Lubeck. Their romances were different again, less bound by feudal contract, more influenced by money, reputation, and proximity. In these towns, courtship often involved writing. Young merchants would pen letters to potential brides, sometimes hiring scribes if they lacked the skill. These letters were full of respectful phrasing, modest compliments, and statements about earnings and prospects. But between the business lines, emotion peeked through. One letter from a weaver's apprentice in Milan begins, "To the lady who sells lace by the second canal, I hope the weather has not spoiled your linens," and ends, "I remain your servant, if you wish to smile again on Thursday." Not dramatic, not dangerous, just hopeful. Women in the merchant class had more say in their marriages in many cases. They could inherit businesses. They could bring large dowries. They were increasingly literate, and so courtship became quieter, less theatrical, more subtle. A man might deliver a bolt of silk by mistake, just to see a girl's face. A woman might bake extra bread for a customer who walked by every day but never bought anything. Flirtation through transaction. Romance via repetition. In a record from Ghent, a baker was fined for giving too many free crusts to a certain girl, despite her never entering the shop. He paid the fine. She married him the next year. In cities, as in courts, as in fields and fairs, love adapted. It wore the clothes of its setting. And when setting and society pushed back, it found smaller places to hide. A wall scratched with initials. A book with a dried petal tucked inside. A note sewn into a pillow's edge. Each told a story. Not loud, not lasting, but human. So very human. There is something strangely tender in the way medieval people lived with impermanence. Everything they built, empires, castles, even cathedrals, was meant to last forever. But everyone they loved could vanish in a moment. Illness, war, the plague, a fall from favor. And perhaps that's why so many love stories from noble courts are preserved not in grand declarations, but in things easily missed. In one Bavarian estate inventory from the 1430s, among the listed items, spoons, linens, cattle, was a book of hours with a rose petal pressed flat between Psalm 18 and Psalm 19. It had been there so long, the page was permanently stained. The ink feathered at the edges, but one marginal note was still legible. She smelled of bread and cedarwood. That's all. No name, no signature, just a memory too dear to throw away. Some historians might dismiss such things as sentimental fluff, irrelevant beside the real engines of politics and property. But in truth, they are the motor. They are what makes the treaties bearable, the marriages survivable. Because even when arranged, even when forced, some marriages blossomed. John of Gaunt, third son of Edward III, married 3 times. His third wife, Catherine Swynford, had once been his mistress. Their love endured for decades, quietly, secretly, until at last he made her his wife. Their children, once bastards, were legitimized and would go on to shape the royal bloodline of England. Some said it was scandalous. Others called it a triumph of love over decorum. The truth was likely somewhere in between. Even popes weren't immune. Pope Innocent III, before taking holy orders, once wrote a love poem to a noblewoman who had rejected him. He never named her, but he kept the poem. Years later, as pope, he ordered it burned. It was copied before it could be, and so even the greatest clerics, sworn to celibacy, left behind sighs. In courts across Christendom, there were rules about how close a man could stand to a woman, how many letters he could send before it was considered improper, what sort of gift could be given, rosaries yes, perfumed gloves no. But people bent those rules daily. A rosary might be perfumed. A letter might be delivered accidentally with another, and the wrong person might find it. There's a court record from Naples where a nobleman was caught with 2 identical rings, each inscribed with the same line of verse. One for his wife, one for another. He claimed coincidence. He was fined, and both women left him. Even the cunning sometimes tripped. Still, the cleverest courtiers knew how to flirt with finesse. They wrote messages using the first letter of each line. They passed notes by hiding them in hollowed-out loaves of bread. In one case, a woman embroidered her feelings into the lining of a man's tunic, stitching the words in white thread on white linen, visible only when held to the light. He never saw it, but he wore it for years, and maybe that was enough, because some expressions of love aren't for the other person. They're for the self, for survival, to have felt, to have hoped. That too is part of the story. Let us close this chapter with a tale rarely told. It is the story of Lady Astrid of Bremen, daughter of a wealthy lord, betrothed at 13, widowed at 19, and never married again. She lived alone for 40 years in a gray stone manor, surrounded by tapestries and letters no one else was allowed to read. When she died, the servants found a chest at the foot of her bed. Inside were dozens of folded scraps, bits of parchment, cloth, even birch bark, each with writing, sometimes only a few words. Your hand shook when you gave me the pear. I watched you through the chapel screen. I could not bear to speak, so I stood in the snow. None were addressed, none signed. A monk who knew her said, "She loved no man and every man." Maybe so, or maybe she simply loved deeply, in a world that didn't offer space to say it. Because for all the power and pageantry, medieval courtly love often came down to this: a glance, a line of verse, petal pressed in a book, and a heart that dared to remember. So now, as we step quietly from the velvet-draped chambers of noble love, down candlelit corridors and past the oil portraits of men and women who rarely smiled in paint but often smiled in secret, we carry with us their truths. That love, no matter how constrained, finds its cracks. That even in political marriages, a touch can linger. That a poem, once written, may outlive a kingdom. And that sometimes, the only record of love is the absence of its denial. As the sun set on castle walls of stone and soft banners waved in the high halls of nobility, love often walked in slippers, never boots. Its presence was light, its absence a thunderclap. There is a letter, written not on paper, but stitched into the inside hem of a courtier's cloak. It was discovered generations later when the garment was donated to a cathedral as an offering. The thread had faded, but still legible were the words. You were kind when no one else was watching. That is why I loved you. No title, no name, just gratitude turned to memory, worn into the lining of everyday life. This, perhaps more than anything else, was the mark of courtly love, the separation of public and private selves. In a world ruled by decorum, by lineage and lineage alone, love often survived only in secret. Let us step for a moment into the world of betrothal contracts. In 14th century France, nobles signed marriage pacts as early as age 7. The language was formulaic. Dowries pledged, land promised, alliances secured. But occasionally, very occasionally, scribes slipped in a note from the bride or groom. One such note, preserved from Brittany, reads, "If he is kind to the dogs and not cruel to servants, I will try my best to love him." A simple wish, kindness not wealth. Even among those who grew up taught to weigh titles and estates, hearts still had preferences. And dogs, it seems, never lied. In noble courts, pageantry often stood in for intimacy. Tournaments were the love letters of steel. Knights chose a lady to dedicate their performance to, though whether she asked for it or not was another matter entirely. Still, some matches were genuine. A knight might ride not for status but for the thrill of seeing her ribbon on his lance. There's a record of a knight in Navarre who insisted on carrying his lady's favor, an embroidered strip of her gown, into every match for 3 straight years, even after they had quarreled and she had married another. When asked why, he replied, "I fight better when I remember her voice." He never married. No scandal, no duel, just quiet loyalty to a moment that had passed. So many of these stories do not end with union. They end with endurance. A glove folded in a drawer, a tune hummed on winter mornings, a name not spoken aloud but never quite forgotten. Even in arranged marriages, which were the norm for nobles, affection sometimes bloomed, came slowly, like ivy creeping up stone. Not grand passion, but a shared rhythm of life. A countess in Bohemia once wrote to her cousin, "He does not understand poetry, but he listens when I read." I think that is better. How many modern hearts echo the same? To be heard, even incompletely, is its own kind of romance. But there were dangers, too. A noblewoman caught in a real affair risked ruin. Not just loss of title, but imprisonment or worse. In England, Lady Anne Boleyn's first brush with Henry VIII may have seemed like a page from a troubadour's song. Secret glances, folded letters, a king in pursuit. But it ended not in triumph, but in a scaffold and a blade. The line between love and power was always sharp. Some chose to walk it anyway. In the court of the Holy Roman Empire, a young nobleman named Friedrich fell in love with the tutor assigned to his cousin, a woman of minor birth but brilliant mind. He commissioned a poem in her honor under the name of a court bard. When it became popular, he anonymously gifted her a copy, claiming it reminded him of her. She never knew it was his, but she kept the parchment folded in her sleeve for the rest of her life. Love unspoken, and yet immortal. Even in the margins of official records, love finds a voice. In a marriage account book from a wealthy Flemish family, one servant wrote a side note. "They do not hold hands in public, but when she fell on the stairs," he ran, "that too is a kind of love. Not roses, not ballads, but action, instinct, a rush without calculation. And then there are the letters never meant to be read." One such letter, found sealed within a reliquary box centuries later, was addressed to the one I almost chose. It reads, "Your silence wounded me more than your refusal would have. I forgave it, but I never forgot." The seal was unbroken. We do not know if it was delivered, but someone somewhere folded that page with shaking hands. Even now, we feel its warmth. So we close this chapter with a truth we have always known, that love, in its 1,000 forms, refuses to be erased. Even by kings, even by death, it lingers in ink and thread, in shadow and song, and most of all, in the small, true things that history rarely records. A shared smile in a solemn room, a quiet promise made by candlelight, a feather folded in a psalter, or the memory of a pear, sweet and clumsy in a shaking hand. In the medieval imagination, love was not simply a feeling, it was a code, a ritual, a theater of manners performed in glances, gestures, and songs. This was the age of chivalry, where knights did not just fight, they adored. Love was not wild, not impulsive. It was disciplined, idealized, often unattainable. In fact, it was designed to be unattainable. We find the roots of this social theater in the courts of Provence and Aquitaine, where troubadours first shaped the culture of fin amour, refined love. This wasn't marriage material. It was often directed toward women already wed, placing the lover in a constant state of yearning. The perfect love, according to this doctrine, was never consummated. Strange as it may seem, it was thought that fulfillment diminished beauty, that the finest form of desire was suspended, floating, longing without possession. One such poem reads, "She smiles, and I forget the lance, the blade, the call, the wound, her favor tied to my left hand. sings louder than the trumpet's sound. Knights would go to tournaments not just to win honor, but to publicly display their devotion. If a lady dropped her veil or handkerchief, it became a relic. If she waved during a tilt, it was enough to sustain a man for months. And all the while, she might say nothing, might be married to another, might not know his name, but the game was its own kind of sacred. Medieval love, as shaped by chivalric tradition, was performative by design. There were steps, formalities, an invisible script. A knight meets a lady. He praises her grace. She rebuffs him gently. He pledges loyalty. She challenges his worth. He proves it on horseback, in poetry, through fasting or silence. She relents slightly. He remains devoted forever. Of course, real life did not follow this arc perfectly, but it shaped how people believed love should feel, especially among the literate. And literature, in turn, reinforced the cycle. We can thank Chrétien de Troyes for much of this. A 12th century French poet, he crafted Arthurian tales full of noble quests and unattainable queens. His Lancelot, hopelessly in love with Queen Guinevere, set the tone for centuries of romantic tragedy. In those stories, honor and love pull in opposite directions. To pursue one is to wound the other, and yet both must be pursued. The perfect knight suffers beautifully, and the perfect lady watches, silent and brilliant as a moon behind clouds. This ideal spread across Europe like candlelight. By the 13th century, even the church had begun to frown upon it, not for its passion, but for its distraction. A monk in York wrote, "Better a man be tempted by wine than by rhyme." But rhyme persisted, and with it song. Troubadours were more than minstrels. They were masters of coded emotion. A nobleman might commission a poem to be sung in court, veiled in metaphor, and everyone would know who it was really for. Sometimes the lady herself, sometimes her rival, sometimes both. Love was entertainment, but it was also a weapon, a stage, a mirror. In public squares, strolling musicians would sing of shepherds and maidens, of swains and jilted lovers. But the nobility took those songs home and read them between the lines. A song about a lost bird might reference a courtier gone too long from a lady's company. A ballad about a stolen kiss in rain might echo a real scandal. Everyone listened. Everyone guessed. In this way, romance lived half in shadow. Even court dances were part of the script. They were opportunities to test boundaries without speaking. A glance held a moment too long. A hand placed an inch higher on the sleeve. A step forward instead of back. The dances themselves, like the estampi, the saltarello, and later the basse danse, were full of spirals, turns, and formalized flourishes. All very proper. But every dancer knew the footwork could hide a message. Step, bow, turn away, was that a rejection? Step, bow, hold gaze, was that a promise? No words exchanged. And yet, entire romances lived and died in the space between movements. Beyond court and castle, these codes filtered into towns and villages. Local festivals began incorporating games of love, where men and women debated romantic ideals in playful rhyme. In Toulouse, there was even a court of love, a mock tribunal where ladies judged the merits of poems, answered questions of fidelity and decorum, and issued verdicts on matters of the heart. It was theater, yes, but it mattered. In a world without dating apps, without private space, without even much privacy, these rituals gave shape to desire. And more importantly, they gave it safety. Not all forms of love could be spoken aloud. Not all hands could be held. But a glance could say everything. And a song could linger long after the last note. Let us return now to the quieter edges of this world. Not the gilded courts or torchlit halls, but the narrow bridges and crooked alleys where everyday people lived by similar rules, in simpler tones. In many small towns, romantic theater took place not on paper or in tournaments but through seasonal festivals. The Maying season, a celebration of spring and fertility, was one such occasion. Boys and girls rose before dawn to gather flowers, decorate doorways, and crown the May Queen. There were songs and dances, feasts and flirts. But there was also a tradition, quietly observed. leaving boughs of blooming hawthorn outside the home of one admired. If the bough remained until morning, it was an invitation. If it was removed, the message was clear. Sometimes the admirer would sit a distance away in the shadows, just to watch, to see if the window opened, to see if a candle was lit, a breathless ritual, requiring no words. On the edge of a forest in Brittany, one village had a rule. No one could speak of a rejected bough aloud. To do so was considered cruel. Let the silence be soft, they said. Even rejection had etiquette. Sometimes, entire romances played out through favors exchanged in church. An extra candle lit at someone's prayer niche. A hymn book left open at a shared psalm. A scarf dropped at the feet of the wrong person, or the right one. In the absence of privacy, meaning had to be scattered like breadcrumbs, quietly hoped for and carefully read. One parchment from an abbey in northern England records a dispute between two novices, not over theology, but over a folded note slipped into a psalter. The older monk wrote, "He reads it when he thinks no one sees. His hands shake." The abbot confiscated it. It contained a single sentence, "You smiled when you gave me bread." So many things begin with kindness, and not all are meant to be, yet they are remembered, and love at its core is memory. In many ways, the rules of medieval love functioned less as laws and more as stage directions. Each person played a role: knight, maiden, spouse, rival, poet. Some embraced it, some subverted it. A young woman in Lubeck disguised herself as a boy to travel with a troupe of performers, not because she longed for theater, but because she loved one of the players. When she was discovered, she was not punished but praised, because she had made it 6 months without breaking character. The townspeople laughed, the boy blushed, and a year later, they were married. Love, it seems, admires a good story, and so much of courtship was storytelling. Men told stories of bravery to impress. Women told stories of dreams to soften. Villagers told stories of secret kisses under the bridge. And nobles hired poets to shape their longing into language fit for court. In all these cases, the heart needed a translator, because raw feeling rarely fit the format. And the format was everything. Let us not forget that medieval people believed in sympathetic magic, the idea that certain objects held emotional power. A braid of hair could draw affection. A name carved into wood could influence fate. A locket worn near the heart could protect a loved one from harm. This belief extended to love. If you dreamed of someone 3 nights in a row, it was said they had dreamed of you as well. If a woman sneezed 3 times during a full moon while thinking of a man, the old wives said she'd marry him. None of it was proven, but it was followed. Belief shaped behavior, and behavior shaped connection. The performance of love became, in time, the foundation of intimacy. And when it broke, when someone failed to follow the script, it caused not just heartbreak, but confusion. There is a record from Siena of a girl who refused every gift, every dance, every poem. She walked the streets with her hair unbraided, her eyes downcast, and would not respond to any flirtation. A boy once wrote, "She plays no part, and so we don't know what to feel." Sometimes the refusal to perform is its own form of power. And now, as the candles burn lower in this imagined chamber, and the night deepens, we return to the idea of love not as conquest, but as witness. To love someone, in any era, is to say, "I see you," not just the role you play, but the quiet truths behind it. In a world as hierarchical and prescribed as the Middle Ages, this was rare, radical even, to be truly seen, to be chosen not for alliance or land or dowry, but because someone liked the way you hummed while stitching, or how you stammered when you lied. That kind of love still existed, mostly in corners, mostly in the margins, but it left a trace. A stable boy who always fetched the same girl's pail. A lady who secretly ordered her knight not to fight. A monk who copied a love poem into a theological text, tucked between Psalms and Proverbs. These are not famous romances, but they are real, and perhaps, in the end, more lasting. So let us end our journey as the medieval day often ended, in quiet reflection. The fire crackles low. The bread is gone. The stew pot empty. Outside, The frost clings to window panes, and the candle guttering by the bedside throws soft light on a folded scrap of parchment. It reads, "If you remember me, I will never be lost." And so they are not. None of them,